Hello and welcome to #The Channel, and my name is Tanya Eisen, and today we have the pleasure of talking to Owen Jones, the writer and Guardian newspaper columnist. Owen was born in Sheffield, brought up in Stockport, and after graduating he worked as a trade union and parliamentary researcher. His first book, Chavs, The Demonisation of the Working Class, published in 2011, and then a second book about the British establishment was published last year in September and 2014. So, Owen, a regular columnist and commentator on programmes like Newsnight, Question Time, all of those kind of things. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to that position?
Well, a little bit about myself. I look about 12.
Always a good thing, trust me.
Like the Milky Bar kid a bit. I guess what I'm trying to do is stand up for issues, people and causes that otherwise are ignored, demonised altogether, and that's what kind of drives me. And I kind of ended up, in terms of what I'm doing, it was a bit of an accident. It wasn't a plan. I never thought I'd end up writing stuff. I didn't think I'd end up doing stuff on telly. I didn't think I'd, have that sort of profile, I guess, and it was never an ambition. I never wanted to be somebody. I always wanted to do something, which is a different thing altogether. So what happened was I wrote a book about class, and it just came out at the wrong time, in the sense that we had a Tory government, austerity, economic crisis. People wanted to talk about class again, and my book just happened to come out at a time when people were ready to talk about it. And off the back of that, I got asked to write other stuff. I got asked to go on TV to talk about other stuff, and it just evolved from there. So it was never a plan, and people often ask me for advice in terms of they want to be a journalist, they want to be a writer, and I find it difficult to know what to say, because that wasn't what my idea was at all. That wasn't my game plan or ambition. I just wanted to fight for my beliefs as best I could, and this just happens to be the best way I can do it.
So why did you decide to write the book then? You say you wrote it at the wrong time, maybe that's the right time, but why did you decide to write that book then?
Well, it's the wrong time in terms of, it's for the people of this country. They're going through a bit of a terrible situation, and I wrote a book about some of the reasons people are going through these difficult times. So it was the wrong time in terms of what it meant for people in Britain. I guess for me, what I wanted to do is find a way of getting across ideas which maybe people like myself, people with my political convictions talk about, but we often just talk to ourselves. We don't reach out beyond the kind of bubble. And I wanted to find a way of how you talk about class, but without it kind of being just tedious and dreary. If I wrote a book called Class in Britain, no one really would have read it. And for me, it was about using a hook and the whole talk of chavs, that word, and the word caught the popular imagination for many years. So it was just a way of getting in on that. But it's hard, It got rejected by publisher after publisher, which is a story you'll often hear from aspiring writers. It's quite hard often. You have to have a thick skin. And it wasn't expected to do half as well as it did. And as I say, it did so well. I'd like to put that down to my talent, but I'm afraid it was to do with the fact that Britain was going through such a terrible time that people were ready to talk about who's got wealth and power, who doesn't, why do some people have all the odds stacked in their favours whilst others don't. And it was just that conversation was there to be had, and I just happened to be there with that book at that particular time.
So you were writing as a columnist. What do you think were the qualities that you need? What is the purpose of a columnist now for people to do? How can you get out there? You've got aspiring people in front of you. What do you need to say to them?
You've got to have conviction, you've got to have belief, and I think, the last thing I'd ever want to do is write for the hell of it. I think some people maybe like to write to cause a reaction. Online they call that trolling, and some columnists are basically glorified trolls. They're there to just wind people up. But for me, I think if you want to, you're there to write opinions, so you need to believe in things. You need to be passionate about things, in my opinion. It's just, for me, it's a platform to get ideas and beliefs and causes across that otherwise just get ignored, that don't get listened to. And I think of things like the housing crisis, or the fact that millions of people in Britain are in work and in poverty, earning their poverty day after day. I think of young people who get punished with debt for wanting to aspire to a better education, whose educational maintenance allowance was taken away, whose youth services were often the first to get cut, slashed away, who face a worse lot in life than their parents, who are going to struggle to get a home they can afford. And I think these are issues that I think are so important and are often ignored and not talked about properly. So for me, a column is just a way of getting these ideas across and giving a platform to people who are otherwise ignored, and trying to get people to do something about it. Because for me, it's not about, you kind of stroke your chin and sit down and just churn something out and everyone looks at it and thinks, oh, isn't that awful? The important thing is to try and motivate people to do something, to have hope. And Tony Benn, who died last year, he was a prominent politician, obviously, and he said the way you get change is the burning flame of anger at injustice and the burning flame of hope at a better world. Well, that's what I try and do with a column. We try and, here's the injustice, this is why we should be angry about it, but hope in the sense of this is something we can do about it. So I think, to begin with, what lots of people should be doing, whether they have a column or not, use social media, get your voice out, use blogging. We can now, the media's become more and more open and democratised because of the internet, because of Twitter, because of blogs. Use that to get your ideas across. Don't feel intimidated, don't feel, oh, I'm too stupid or I don't know enough about these issues. There were so many people who experience issues on a daily basis, including people at this sixth form, and people need to hear their voices. They need to hear what they're going through. And I think that is far more valuable than a columnist from a very privileged background who doesn't meet people from a variety of different backgrounds just spouting off things from an ivory tower. We need to hear far more voices, women, working class people, people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. Those voices are too often not heard at all. And anything that can get those voices across is really important in my opinion.
Good, yeah, excellent. Right, so in your book about the working class, you talk about the chav as a stereotype. And that's used by a government as a way of avoiding the real sort of widening inequality that we're faced with. So can you explain to us why you think that the governments need to do that, why we're being fobbed off with this as a way? And is it particularly a British problem or is it bigger?
Well, what I was taking on in that book is this myth that everybody now is middle class and all that remains of the old working class is this kind of feckless work-shy rump on sink estates and so on. And I thought that's a false dichotomy. I don't think that's the reality of life in Britain. So I was trying to show, well, actually, this is the reality, and this is, the reality of working class Britain is something very different from that. And that was the point. But also what we've seen in the last 30 years is a shift in the way we look at things like poverty and unemployment. In the aftermath of World War II, the idea was poverty and unemployment were caused by social injustice. There were problems with the way society was run. They were faults in society. So because of that, you had to have a welfare state and so on to deal with it, to fix those problems. But we shifted from seeing them as social problems to individual failings, that if you were poor, if you were unemployed, then it's your fault. You're responsible. You need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, even if, to paraphrase Barack Obama, you don't have any boots. That, that if you're unemployed, you need to get on your bike and sort it out yourself. And that shift is something I wanted to challenge as well. But also, for me, I think what we've seen is an attempt by powerful people to get us to turn on each other rather than hold the powerful to account. If you're a low-paid worker, your wages have been cut by your boss, your in-work benefits have been cut by the government because millions of workers claim benefits because their wages are so low, then instead of being angry at the government and instead of being angry at your boss, you're told to envy the unemployed person down the road living in a mansion made out of widescreen television sets. And if you're a private sector worker, your pensions have been decimated, and instead of being angry at your boss, you're told to envy the teacher, the nurse who still has their pension intact. Why should they when you don't? And if you can't get a home you can live in, an affordable home, because governments haven't built housing, or you can't get a secure job because they've been ripped out of our economy, you're told don't be angry at the powerful, envy the immigrant getting the job or the home that should be yours instead. And what they're telling people is, you've been mugged, but don't be angry at the fact you're being mugged. Be angry at the fact your less deserving neighbour's not being mugged quite as much as you have. And that's just the politics of divide and rule. And instead of being angry with the powerful, bankers who plunge this country into economic disaster, tax dodgers who don't pay £25 billion worth of tax every year while services are cut and the rest of us we will have to pay our taxes, poverty-paying bosses who leave millions of workers in poverty. Instead of holding those people to account, we're too busy pointing our finger at immigrants and unemployed people and public sector workers instead. And that suits the powerful to do that, because they know if we're angry at each other, we're not going to be angry with them. So for me, it was a case of asking people, instead of turning on each other, let's start holding the powerful to account instead, which is the last thing they want. And that's the only way we're going to build a just and fair society.
So do you think that's how we can how do you get this message across to engage young people in this argument? Because you've said in the past about being, you know, a lot of young people are disengaged and sometimes angry about it all. But that anger is directed at these other people who they feel are in that. So how do we engage them? How do we engage young people in the political argument?
Well, whenever I go to sixth forms and schools, I still look like the youngest person in the room. But I always find that...
Lucky you.
I always find that actually young people are really informed and educated and aware of the issues that confront them. They know how difficult things are going to be in terms of, as things stand, getting a home they can afford to live in the future, being punished with debt for wanting to carry on an education, their youth services being slashed away, struggling to get a secure job, you know, being stuck on 0-hour contracts and you know, having to earn their poverty in low-paid jobs, lacking basic security. People are aware of that, but the problem is there's so much anger out there and there's so much fear, but there's one thing missing, and that's hope. And without hope, people just give up. And Harvey Milk, a fighter for LGBT rights in the 1970s in the United States, said, I know you cannot live on hope alone, but without it, life is not worth living. I happen to believe that's true. And for me, the most important thing that has to happen now is to give people a sense of hope, because otherwise people become resigned. They just, you know, the defenders of injustice always want us to believe that injustice is just like the weather. You can complain about it raining, but there's nothing you can do about it. It's just the way the world is. Well, I reject that. And equally, people turn on their neighbours, as you say. We've got to give people hope. And I talk about hope by saying how different things can be. That, you know, instead of expecting millions of people to earn their poverty, everybody in work should have a living wage. That instead of leaving people trapped in social housing waiting lists or overcrowded homes or stuck with private landlords charging rip-off rents, whilst we spend billions of pounds in housing benefits subsidising these landlords, instead we should let councils build housing again, properly, to give people jobs. That we should create proper jobs like they've done in Germany in renewable energy to take on the environmental and the jobs crisis. That however rich you are, however many smug accountants you have, you should pay every penny of your tax. That given the wealth of the top 1,000 people has doubled in the last 5 years, they can afford to pay more taxes when so many people are struggling. That, you know, instead of public utilities and services being run by rip-off profiteers like our railways, which we spend far more public money on now than we did when they were run by the state, that we should bring that back under the control of the people of this country. So it's to talk about these policies, these alternatives, which I just happen to believe are common sense, to be honest with you, to show that there is an alternative, a viable alternative, but also to show people fight back and it wins. You know, young people who were angry at tax avoidance, they set up a group called UK & Cut, and that occupied shops and businesses whose owners weren't paying their taxes. They forced tax avoidance on the agenda. They forced politicians and journalists to talk about tax avoidance. I think of the cinema workers down in the Ritzy Cinema down in Brixton in South London, who, predominantly young people again, who were getting paid ridiculous poverty wages, just a joke. You know, they keep this cinema open, they make it profitable, and then they're just expected to have no rights in the workplace and rubbish pay. But they took action, they went on strike, they built a coalition, and they forced the cinema to hike their wages. And it was the same at the Curzon Cinema as well in London. I look at that and think, these are young people standing up for themselves. And they're not standing up for themselves just to get something off the chest, just to say, at least they gave it a go. They're doing it to win dignity for themselves, to win security and to win a future. And it works, it pays off. And that's what we need to see far more of, young people like those young people fighting for themselves and fighting for their generation.
Okay, well, can we hear from some of the young people now? So has anyone got a question?
Or just heckle, that's fine.
Yeah, we've got big voices. Great, thank you. Can you just wait for that's it, right.
Have you ever been in trouble with the law for reporting or researching a story?
I haven't, no. And often, I mean, a number of journalists I know have been. During the student protests back in 2010, when tens of thousands of students took to the streets and also occupied their universities and in some cases schools actually in protest at the trebling of tuition fees and the scrapping of EMA, and the police were just completely out of order in the way they behaved. You know, young people are patronised, aren't they, for being apathetic, only wanting to watch X Factor and so on. Then they take to the streets, and what happens? To stand up for themselves and engage in politics. They were kettled, they were battened by police officers. And I know some journalists who were reporting that who were battened by police officers. So the idea, you know, it was just troublemaking, you know, youths who they were attacking was disproved by the fact that journalists came under attack by the police as well. So there's that. But one of the points I make actually just about the law is, and actually I think there's a wider point there. I often meet young black men who have been stopped and searched by the police all their lives, since the age of 12. And that's just become part of their, part of their experience. I've never been stopped and searched in my life by a police officer. And the similarity between me and many of these young black men who I speak to is they've never been charged with a crime either. But they're constantly stopped and searched, and it feels like harassment. And if you're black, you're 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched on suspicion of drugs. When actually, according to the government's own statistics, if you're black, you're less likely to use drugs. So there's no basis for it whatsoever. It's just pure racism. So for me, the way that people are treated by the police often is completely discriminatory, and it undermines the cohesion of our society because people get this resentment towards the law which they shouldn't. So no, I've never faced police harassment. And another example though of that with other journalists and activists anyway, UK and Cut, which I mentioned before, we protested about tax avoidance, and they took part. They just occupied a department store. They didn't do anything. They were just in a shop, and they all got arrested and then prosecuted. And for me, you know, that was these were people standing up for themselves, a proud tradition in this country of protest, peaceful civil disobedience, and the police attacked them for doing that. So, as I say, whilst I haven't personally been attacked by the police, I do think the way the police treat certain sections of our community and also peaceful protesters is totally unacceptable. It has to change.
Thank you. And another question? Oh, hi.
Why is research so important?
Why is research so important? Well, it's important that when people make claims that they're backed up by evidence, because I think often we'll get in the media claims which are actually totally spurious or just not true at all. Often, partly, the reason that's the case is it's what I said before about trying to turn people against each other, you know, to make people feel that all unemployed people are a bunch of scroungers, that immigrants are coming over here and taking your jobs and homes and all the rest of it. This attempt to divide and rule. And I think it's important that those claims are disproven, and that means having research and evidence. It's that phrase, isn't it? It speaks about speaking truth to power. Well, to do that, you need to know your stuff. So it's really important you evidence your claims, that you can back them up, particularly if you oppose the status quo, because you actually come under more scrutiny. You're expected to do more to justify your beliefs than if you're someone who's just swimming with the current rather than standing up against prevailing wisdom. So that makes it important to kind of bulletproof yourself, that you can, you know, if you come under a lot of scrutiny, you can justify what you say. But I say all this, in terms of winning arguments, it's not always just about facts and statistics. There's a political linguist in the United States called George Lakoff, and he says the right wing, they often use stories. The left often use facts and statistics. But we're human beings, aren't we? We're not robots, we're not machines. We empathise, we think about each other as human beings. So if you just rely on facts and statistics, then you're not going to win people over. It goes over people's heads. That's why on the front of the Sun, the Daily Mail, they don't have a front page about the real numbers of benefit fraud, which is 0.7%. Instead, what they do is they just find stories of the most shameless scrounger they can find to make people think that's the tip of the iceberg, to make their readers' blood boil. And it works. And I think, for me, it's about balancing facts and statistics with those human stories that people can relate to. So I'll give you one example of that, benefit sanctioning, which is where people's benefits are stopped as a punishment. And this is used in the most arbitrary way possible to just strip people of the support they need. In the last 18 months, over 1 million unemployed people have had their benefits stopped. But if I was to use a story to back that up, it's Stephen Taylor, a 60-year-old army veteran, who was selling poppies for the Royal Legion. He was desperately looking for work whilst he was raising money for maimed and injured former comrades of his. And he was looking for work in a supermarket where he was selling those poppies. It's so hard at the age of 60 to find work, but he was doing his best. But he had his benefits sanctions stopped for 4 weeks on the basis his volunteering for the Royal Legion showed he wasn't trying hard enough to look for work. I think that's more compelling than if I just say 1 million people have had their benefits stopped, because it's an example of a human being. So yes, we need research about facts and statistics, but that research should also be about human stories that people can relate to, because that's how you win people over, not just rationally, but also emotionally as well.
Thank you. Another question? No? Yeah.
What's your next target for your next book?
Writing a book, by the way, is a nightmare, and I should probably encourage everyone, but it is awful. No, it is a lot of work. It is a lot of
And
effort.
a lot of research.
And a lot of research, exactly, a lot of research. So yeah, I do have to write another book. But it's going to be called The Politics of Hope, and it comes back to what I was saying earlier, which is you can't get people to go out and change things unless you give them a bit of hope. And I think the problem maybe with the first 2 books is there's quite heavy on the anger bit, quite heavy on this is the problem, and maybe less on this is what we could do instead. And the danger is if I just go on about what's wrong with everything all the time, people just go, oh, how awful and depressing everything is, and just give up and just yell at the TV sets, but that's it. I want people to feel hopeful. I want people to think they can change things, that it's in their power to do that they can go out and they can organise, and if they get people together like them, then they can force the people with power to change. So the next book's about hope, and what I want to do is draw examples from all over the world of things where things are done differently, like Finland, where they don't have private schools, they don't have grammar schools, they don't have any selection, and they've got one of the best education systems in the world. Or Sweden, where they have a welfare state which looks after people from cradle to grave, where living standards are much better and more people are in work. Norway, where they've got this justice system where their prisons are far less punitive than ours, where prison sentences are a lot less, and their reoffending rate is 1/3 of ours. So I want to look at examples where things can be done differently and work as evidence, research to back up how society here could be run in a different way. So it's about hope, and what I want to do all the time is encourage people to take action and not feel resigned to the way things are, that injustice isn't inevitable, that they can change things. So the next book, all about hope. It will be, I might subtitle it, things will be fine in the end.
Right, okay. I think we can squeeze in one more question if we could. Yep.
Hello. Do you think college students stand a chance of breaking into the journalism industry without a degree?
So college students getting into journalism by a degree. Well, the problem I've got with the media at the moment and how it's run is it often prevents people who aren't from privileged backgrounds from even breaking in. Part of the problem is local newspapers have declined, which is a bigger problem to deal with, and local newspapers often trained up particularly aspiring working class journalists. You start at your local paper and you climb up the ranks. But the bigger problems are, firstly, unpaid internships, which are a total disgrace, where you expected to work for free for months at a time or longer with no promise of a job at the end of it. And who can afford to do that? You know, especially in London, which is one of the most expensive cities on the face of the earth. If you expected to work for free to be able to get into the media, then you're going to stop lots of talented people, and the only people you'll get are people who can live off the bank of mum and dad, people who basically have rich enough parents to subsidise them. The other problem is postgraduate qualifications, partly what you're talking about, they're so expensive again to do a master's, especially when you factor in living costs. And again, that stops people from different backgrounds from being able to enter journalism. And that's why, according to a government report a few months ago, over half of the top 100 journalists are privately educated, but only 7% of people go to a private school. And you end up with a media then that doesn't reflect and represent the people of this country and all their diversity and their experiences and the issues that concern them. You just end up with a media which is the mouthpiece of people who are very privileged, basically upper middle class white men who live in London. And that has to change. So we need to get rid of unpaid internships, and we need scholarships, particularly scholarships targeted at underrepresented people in the media, women, working class people, black and minority ethnic people, so we can actually hear those experiences. I mean, I said before about the experience of stop and search, which I don't have. Well, most journalists don't have that experience, so no wonder it's not a priority. So same, you know, housing, that should be a big priority, but it isn't for many of those journalists. They don't suffer the housing crisis. It's the same, Muslims, there's lots of anti-Muslim prejudice at the moment, and Muslims are stigmatised as a whole group. Well, if you had more Muslim journalists who could speak about their experiences in the media, that wouldn't be the case. So we need to get rid of unpaid internships and have scholarships so people from all backgrounds have a shot at being able to get into the media. But in the meantime, I want people to use social media, blogging and all the rest of it to try and get their name heard, get their voice out there. And that's another way of getting into the media, which doesn't rely on having to work for free, which partly some people have to do at the moment.
Okay, so can I just ask a little twister of a question? I hear that you are touring with Paloma Faith. What's that all about? Are you taking up a singing career, or you're the warm-up act?
I'm not gonna pick out my guitar, and I'm not gonna subject people to that. That would be basically torture. It's probably banned by the UN or something. Yeah, she asked me. She got in touch, Paloma. She's lovely. She's a fantastic and quite inspiring person, actually. You know, she grew up in Hackney in a working-class family, and she's so down to earth. She's really open-minded. And she just got in touch because she wanted, you know, to get this old tradition of politics and music going again, and just engage her fans in democracy and the issues that affect them. So I didn't. She did ask me to go on tour, and I couldn't do that because I've got to juggle so much other stuff. But I said I'd do 2 gigs with her. So I did Brighton last week, and I'm doing the O2 next week, which is a bit weird. But I did the Pyramid stage at Glastonbury in 2013 after Jake Bugg, and people were pretty nervous about that. They thought I'd get bottled off stage or something. But I had a really good response there. So I thought, actually, if you pitch it right, you know, obviously people are there to have a laugh and listen to music and have, you know, a good night out with their mates. So you've got to take that into account and pitch it in that way, not go on for too long. And yeah, I think it's a really good idea. You know, I just think, you know, I just want to put my money where my mouth is. You know, it's easy. I could just speak to the converted all the time, and people already agree with me. Or just the sorts of people who watch kind of current affairs programmes. But I want to reach people beyond that, you know. I think these issues affect so many people. I want people to engage in the world around them in their democracy. And so it's almost like the Paloma Faith gig test. That if you can pitch that at a Paloma Faith gig and not get bottled off stage, then maybe there's hope for this country after all. And that's the experiment. And I think, you know, I can't speak more highly of Paloma for asking me to do it, and she really is she's such a lovely human being as well, which matters.
Great. Okay. Well, I'd like to say thank you very much to our studio audience. Thank you for the interesting questions, and thank you very much, Owen Jones, for coming along.
No, it was an honour. Thank you, everyone. That was great questions. So thank you.
That's great, and thank you for coming to Barking and Dagenham College and talking to us. I am Tanya Eisen, and this was #The Channel. Thank you very much.